I'm Avinav Pad from the University of Hartford. Thank you all for three excellent papers to start us off, and I'll ask something that's sort of more of a general question, but that is raised, I think, in Eva's title, which is I want to probe a little more this term that you use of post-testimony, or the age of post-testimony, because as you all alluded to, there are various challenges that, as the field has developed, have identified sort of the challenges of using testimony. You've talked about the timing of testimony, direct testimony, medium post-war testimony, testimonies collected many decades afterwards, the questions of reliability of memory, Browning's sort of effort to create sort of a collective group of testimonies that can be pulled up against one another, and as he says, sort of looking at his two studies of looking at both collective studies of perpetrator testimony versus survivor testimony. Surely when one is using testimonies in which most of your subjects are perhaps trying to lie, then surely in a case where they are telling the truth, it's even more reliable, as he points out. But I'd also add that the work of those from the field of trauma studies who point to the difficulty of even conveying through testimony traumatic events, and as Paul raised, sort of other methodological issues that arise. So what I'd like to ask you is sort of this term post-testimony. Are we talking about sort of more refined approaches to using testimony in a reliable sense? Noah Shanker talks about how there are frames that frame testimony, but it's not a challenge against using testimony. It's just ways for us to sort of discern and better use testimony in our research. So I'd like to ask all of you what we think about when we think about, are we really talking about post-testimony, or are we talking about a more refined sort of use of testimony in all of our research?
So I started conducting interviews 30 years ago, and I found the last survivors in Slovakia, in Košice, who were adult in the interval period. And this is a long way. And I recognized in the last couple of years that the genre of the testimonies is changing. They are really testimonies in the last minutes. The eldest interviewees give us testimonies. We have to understand what testimony in this means. And on the other side, the digital archival projects are flourishing. You can reach every testimony via internet or with special codes, and you can search for special texts and sequences, and I think it's a real danger. So we have to take a break. We have to ask ourselves what we can do with this kind of archiving, with this kind of digitization, how we, as Noah Shanker also thematized it, what are the tasks and missions of these archives for digitation? How can we integrate in our analysis also these tasks and missions? Because without understanding the Shoah Foundation archive, I was there in Hungary when the Shoah Foundation archive started to conduct their interviews. I know how the interviews were conducted. So I think we have to understand why and how these last digital archive projects started to work, what they wanted to show, what they now want to show us, and how we historians, sociologists, anthropologists can deal with this huge amount of survivor testimonies. My first problem is this cherry picking. So I'm an old school oral history or biographical interviewer, and I think the interview has its own structure, and this is really a kind of performance among the interviewee and the interviewers. And first I had to understand this performance, and then later on I can start to cherry pick, but not starting with this attitude. So this is my most critical point.
Just to add one reflection concerning the term post-testimony. It's the first time that I heard this, but it reflects me the idea of post-memory. And the post-memory is related to the awareness and memory of those who didn't experience the Holocaust, the second generation and the people who were born after. And I think it's also the challenge to deal with this post-memory in the future.
So I'll respond by expanding on something I mentioned about the way that philosophy, my own discipline, thinks about testimony. In a weird way, things are inverted. So thinking about, as I said at the beginning, the loss of survivors who could give direct testimonial accounts. Philosophy talks about sources of knowledge that are perceptual or based on memory, and then it says every other source of knowledge is testimonial in the sense that it requires someone else who has a perceptual or a memory of an event passing that on to you. So even in thinking about this, philosophers on that view would say documents that you didn't see signed or delivered would be testimonial sources. It's a weird inversion of the historiographical account, but it gives us a way to thinking about post-testimony is, in a sense, the emergence of only testimonial knowledge in that philosophical sense, rather than the existence of any direct or direct memories of these events, right? And I think there are others who will question whether someone can take over the task of testifying for you or can take over the task of remembering for you. I think we're going to have papers on that subject, so I don't want to give the last word. But that's a different take on the question of post-testimony, I think, than what we've heard. Thank you.
I was wondering about the idea of the breakdown of norms. It seems for me a little bit very kind of black and white, because there's not much more fluid in the sense, for example, there are norms, but they are interpreted differently. They aren't breaking down, they are still there, but people use them in a very different way than before. And also more specifically, when you cite the Auschwitz as a place, can we actually really talk about breakdown of norms there, since this is a new place with new norms, and there were no old norms there. So can you elaborate a little bit more?
I just wanted to add another question to this issue. When you're talking about norms, I'm thinking about values. And it was a great research by Polish sociologists in the 70s on values in Auschwitz, in concentration camp. And the title of the book is The Values of the Violence. And her the most, how to say, short thesis was that under these circumstances, some value existed, and she told about reinterpretation of values in such circumstances. How it's if it's the same to people told about norms.
Thank you. I feel luxurious having two questions to respond to. I'll try to do it quickly. I'll try to speak to both first. I realize they're connected. There were several features to the question. I think of these as sort of idealized ways of thinking about different kinds of changes in norms, but the question about which ones most accurately apply, or whether there's a sort of limit case where you couldn't have an environment without norms at all. If it's right that sort of our cognition, and this goes into, I guess, deep questions about our understanding of the world, sort of almost Kantian questions, right? if it's true that norms are sort of basic to our cognition of the world, it's hard to know whether you could sustain over time a context in which there were no norms. Many of the testimonies that I cited and looked at describe exactly either the development of new norms for these entirely new and awful places in the camps and ghettos, or they describe what I referred to very briefly as cases of an old norm adapting to a new context, right? There's a line of research I'm pursuing that talks about differences in the ways that men and women in the camps and ghettos sort of experience their reality, and whether persistent sort of gender norms may have continued to exist and to shape or structure experience differently. There's a volume called Different Horrors, Same Hell that has a lot of good essays that I think speak to this question. And I think that the sort of basis for thinking that at least there's a perception of a loss of norms also comes from the testimonies themselves, right? So the Olga Kovacs, who I cited, right, she suggests, you know, in Auschwitz, everything was permitted and nothing was permitted, right? Or everything was right and nothing was right. So that's a first order claim about a bit of historical experience, and the question is, how do you interpret that experience? What sort of concepts are you bringing to it? The historians who I've looked at, they talk about norm breakdown, they talk about norm inversion. I'm trying to sort of formalize and say, well, what actual features of norms are they describing here, and what are the processes? How could we get evidence for these processes actually occurring? So I agree, it's an open question how you could actually get evidence for a condition of complete norm breakdown. It's a different kind of open question how sustainable that would be over time. The question about norms versus values, in some cases of norms, particularly legal and moral norms, we often say these are sort of justified on the basis of deeper values, right? But there's some ways in which historians have talked about these conditions which do sort of merge the two. So I'm thinking of a debate between, the apparent debate, I don't know if they've directly discussed it with each other, Lawrence Langer, who you cited, and Christopher Browning about family ties, right? And whether family ties endured and remained a source of value in these horrific contexts, or whether they actually broke down. Langer cites a few examples in, I think, the Ruins of Memory book, where he suggests that actually, you know, even family ties became sort of distorted, confused, or may have ceased to bond people together. Christopher Browning in the Collected Memories book, and I don't know the Testimony to Survival, is that the name of the book? I don't know whether he expands on this point there. He suggests that actually these family ties are an example of, you might describe it as a basis of value in a world where lots of other values have disappeared or become impossible to pursue. You might describe it as a set of norms prescribing particular kinds of behavior, particular kinds of care towards people who are related to you. So that's how I would begin to answer the question, how do norms relate to value? But then again, that's a very big philosophical topic, and there are lots of much smarter philosophers than I who say what is basic, what is not.
No? No more time?
You said yes.
I have a question, though. I'm allowed to pose a question.
You're the chair.
Okay, I'm the chair. So I can one more question.
To the sociologist, but this could be a question for all of you. My training is historical. And I think one of the interesting questions that is going to come out of this is how the different methodological approaches can complement one another. Sociology, philosophy, history, literature, and so forth. But I understand that the sociologists operate under the assumption that they can offer something special about insights into emotions, for example. When the door shuts, noise in a concentration camp, how did the inmates react to that? And something that's more difficult for historians based on their methodological tools to gain access to. But what happens, but human beings are so complex, and even when one uses sociological methods, I'm sure that in concentration camps, I know, I'm the child of survivors, I know, I've heard these things, that people had different emotional responses to slamming doors, to noise, to smoke, to various things. How do sociologists, given your method, how do you reconcile contradictory testimony or conflicts in one's representation or expression of human emotion?
Again, my question. So my point is another point. Shortly. There is a lot of testimony which dramatize emotional attitudes. during the deportation and in the everyday life of the camp, if I may use this category. Usually you can use everyday life as a sociological category, but for example, in the last 2 months of Mauthausen, it is impossible to use the everyday life as a sociological category. But back to the question, yes, our feelings are very complex and very individual. But if somebody mentions this loud and this sounds and this voice, it hardly ever accepted from the historical point of view. If you read the Browning book, which is one of the most beautiful books on this topic, when he tests the testimonies of relevance, the most relevant source is seeing, and then listening, and then listening from somebody. So he itself builds a kind of hierarchy of feelings, and the hierarchy of feelings represent also the relevance of the source. And I only wanted to mention that we have other possibilities to use these testimonies, thinking these emotional expressions of the testimonies and try to understand this kind of relevance. What does it mean?
Do you want to?
I understood your question with regard to representativeness of the data, and there is no statistical representativeness with regard to Holocaust. We can talk about phenomenological or phenomenological representativeness. It means that you build on the basis of your research analysis, you can build typology of emotions, experiences, circumstances, different details of the survival experience, but survival or not survival, but not any typically sociological conclusions. It's much short.
Okay, Paul, do you want to say something to that?
I don't think I have anything distinctive to say. I guess my understanding has been that historiography is a field that requires historians to make judgments based on their assessment of the balance of the evidence. And so I'm not sure a strict methodological rule will be applicable in this kind of case of contradiction.
Very good, that's good. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in